Okay, so I want to do another one of those real-time paint with me type paintings, and I did some experimentation the other day. And I was playing around the other day and I painted this farmland scene that I really enjoyed painting and I think is pretty easy to do. It's actually based on this picture I took that's kind of near where I live in the farmland area of Colorado, and I really like the angles and the contrast of the colors. Now, as you can see, this is not a winter scene. This was more kind of a spring-like scene when everything is starting to pop up and is that just super vivid bright greens. And then also the wheat type bright yellow color. I didn't actually edit this photo at all. This is the colors that it was, and it's even really muted just based on because I printed it on just a normal printer. But I thought this would be a really fun exercise to do because we have to do a little composition. So we're going to need to kind of keep an eye on certain areas, and a lot of times when I show you how to do a painting, we're going over most of an area and then we're completely softening down, things like that. But this we're actually going to have to work in segments, so we're going to have to do a little planning. Now the way that I treat different reference photos is kind of as an idea and a guideline, not necessarily as exactly how I'm going to paint it. Because it's hard to stay 100% true, and also watercolor lends itself to certain things. So we want to be a little forgiving of ourselves with this. But here is the reference photo. And if you are somebody who wants to sketch first, I'm not actually going to be sketching in here. You'd want to kind of set where your horizon line was, real light. You're going to also want to make sure you kind of pick out this shape so it's got a nice line here. It's flat up here, then it curves over, and there are a bunch of different segments here. And then I'm going to take some liberties with this because I don't want to have to put in quite as much of this dirt and things like that just because it gets a little bit muddy and hard to kind of do. This is going to be another tutorial where I'm going to be painting in real time and need to use the hairdryer, so that's going to be our friend today. Other than that, you are going to need some paper. I have some 140-pound cold pressed Canson paper in here that I've already kind of blocked off. You don't need to do that if you're working in a sketchbook. I just like the look of it. I'm going to be using my trusty size 12 round brush. I've got my palette here. This is the Unicorn Food palette. Whatever palette you're using, if it's a dry palette, you need to go ahead and just spritz all those colors so they can get to know each other. You're also going to need a rag or a sponge, something like that, and you're going to need a couple cups of water. I'm going to take a little sip of coffee. First thing I want to do is mix up a nice blue sky. Oh, and you might want some tester strips. But the very first thing is I want to mix up a nice light blue color. I'm going to dip into my blue raspberry or kind of phthalo type blue color, then into this blueberry muffin, which is kind of more like an ultramarine color. And because these colors are super duper bright, you could either make the sky more muted to make them pop, or you could go more teal if you kind of wanted to push the brightness up. I want a little more pigmentation, so I'm going to add in a little more blue. Because we are going to start by working a little bit wet on wet, and this will definitely desaturate when I add it on the wet. All right, so I've got my nice blue color. I'm going to wash my brush off. Then I want to take my piece here, and I actually want to wet, I'm going to wet about half of the way down or a third of the way down, depending on where you wanted to place this. This might be a nice placement to actually have the foreground, the sky be a third of the way down. So let's actually do that. So we're just going to wet our paper about a third of the way down. Because I want this to be a little bit of a gradient, but I don't need this to be perfect. If you actually even look at the photo, you can see it's not a perfect gradient. It kind of is a little darker on the left side than the right side, which I think helps with some of the visual interest. Then once my paper is wet, not too wet, but enough where I can see the texture underneath, I'm just going to take my color that I mixed up and I'm going to place it kind of in that right corner, thin it out a little bit, wash my brush, and then soften down to that third line. Because we're working wet on wet, we've got a little more to play with here. I want to maintain a little bit of an angle, but this book is pretty heavy, so I'm going to prop this up so that it can be at an angle, but all I have to do is hold it down. And this isn't perfect, but we can come in here and adjust a little bit more. Again, it's not perfect, but it doesn't need to be. This isn't really our focal point, so something like that is going to do pretty well. I have a little extra water. I'm just going to grab that. So we could definitely take our blow dryer and dry this now, but we don't necessarily need to yet. We can actually move on to that big yellow segment. Notice how it doesn't touch the sky in any way. So we can actually kind of block in where that's going to be without touching this, because we don't want it to touch because it'll run into it and we'll get a green sky. We do need to mix up a nice yellow color. I'm going to put a little water in here so we have enough. Grabbing some of that corn on the cob and some of that banana split. And that's going to give us we need a little bit more. I also have a little green in there because my colors were a little dirty. I'm not too worried about that because I'm also going to add in a little bit of that marmalade color, or kind of like a vermilion color, to warm this just a little bit. And I think that will be a nice, beautiful color. So remember, this actually goes off the page over here, but it's flat on the top because that's where that Farmland ends. It's thin here, and it comes over at an angle like this. We're going to have it kind of disappear here, and then it actually gets a little bit wider, even wider than that. Over here, I'm going to kind of fill in most of this, then I'm going to wet my brush. And I'm going to soften this part down because I don't really want a harsh line right here where I'm going to be placing some of that grass. While it's still a little wet, we can come in with some other colors, like some of this vermilion type color. And you can kind of start to hint to some of those rows. You could even grab some more of the true kind of yellow type color. Whoops, went a little out of the line there. That's okay. We just want a little variation. Show a little movement. If you wanted to add in some kind of brown, now would be a good time to take maybe some of that candy apple and a little bit of that guacamole. This is kind of like a burnt brown. And add that in a couple places. You could also come in and lift out a little bit. I wish this was staying down a little bit more. Maybe I need to actually grab a clip. Because as you can see, this is really popping up here. There we go. That's going to be a little more stable. So you could come in and even lift out some highlights in there. We just want some texture. And technically you want those lines to be thinner towards the back because they're a little further away, and thicker up here. But even just some general movement in that shape is going to help. All right, now everything else we're going to do is either going to touch the sky or this part of this, so we do need to take a second to dry all of this off. That's going to be fairly dry there, but it is still pretty hot from the heat of the hairdryer. So next I do want to let it kind of cool down a little bit. And that's fine because I think I want to start by blocking in some of this kind of dirt color over here. So we actually need to mix that color up. And this was actually a pretty good start. So that was, you could take any browns that you have, but for this one, I don't have a brown in this set, so I have to mix it. I'm going to take some of that candy apple, which is a red type color, and some of this guacamole, which is a olive green type color. And that's actually a pretty nice start to that brown color. I want to tone this down or make it a little bit softer. So I'm going to grab a little bit of blue. Maybe I got a little too much in there. Oh, I didn't have as much as I thought. And that's more the color I personally want. You could adjust this if you wanted. Now, again, I'm going to start this just kind of by butting this up here. Making some lines. I'm going to wash my brush. I'm going to soften things together. And I'm also going to soften this down because, again, this is where we're going to have some of that grass kind of in the foreground. You could bring it down a little more. I dropped some water in there, so I got a little bloom. But we can actually take advantage of that to get some of the shapes. So we can come in and re-drop in some color. And depending on the paper you're using, I'm using the exact same colors I did with that previous example that's hidden back here. And that paper is a different type of paper and it doesn't have quite as many backgrounds in it because it takes longer to dry. This is Canson paper and it does tend to get more of these backgrounds, which I love for things like this. But if you're not getting this exact thing, it might be the paper you're using. And that's totally fine. You can make it work. Now, while it's still a little bit wet, let's mix up a little bit of kind of a blue-green. I'm just going to grab some of both of these green colors and a little bit of this blue raspberry color. Maybe a little bit more of that blue raspberry and blueberry muffin and a little more of that guacamole color. Now this field has some green in it, and I might have waited a little bit too long, but I kind of want to texture some parts of this. I did wait too long. So I put a little down, I'm going to re-wet this. I'm going to grab some more of that brown color. Again, I just kind of want to show the movement. But I want this to be a little wet because I want parts of this to be softer. And let's show some of those little plants, make them a little bit smaller as you go backwards. So you get a little more perspective. They're going to be bigger up here, smaller back there. Crops often grow a little patchy. A little known fact, I actually grew up on a corn and pinto bean farm. I was a champion tube setter. I'm going to add in some more of these little kind of dots just to kind of indicate some of those plants. And as you can see, because it's a little wet, it's going to kind of soften, and it's okay if it's a little bit blurry. It's going to kind of help create the illusion. We can come back in when that's drier and add in some more emphasis and some darks and things like that into some of those. But for now, let's move on. We want to mix up some more green because we actually need two different greens for these back two fields. If you take a look at this, how this is set up, we were on a dirt road here. This is a ditch, and then there is a farm here that has something popping up. This is probably something like sugar beets, and then we've got some wheat, and then we have some other green. This one's probably corn back here, kind of that nice, even, smooth texture. So we have a nice light green, and then we have a much darker, deeper green before we get to some of these trees. So let's put our light green one, and that light green one, it has a slight kind of sage look to it. So I'm going to take some of that green I just made, grab a little more of those greens, grab some more of, I'm going to kind of lean more towards this blueberry muffin one, and we're just going to play with the saturation level to get it lighter. I want it to be a little more blue towards the blue side, but I need it to be a little lighter, so let's put some water in there. There we go. That's going to be a nice color. And this one is going to have a nice flat spot here. It's going to actually kind of come up a little bit further. Meet this here. And we just want to make sure we're leaving a little sliver for that darker green part. As well as, since it'll be a darker spot, you can add in more. Doesn't need to be absolutely perfect, but let's leave it kind of like that for a second. And while we're waiting, let's kind of darken this color up a little bit. We want to increase kind of that color saturation. Because while it's still a little wet, I do want to come right along this kind of border and just kind of tap. Just to kind of create that border there. It's going to kind of show the boundary between the two that's not quite as kept as the field that's kind of adjoining it. All right, again, I'm going to now this is mostly dry, but not entirely, so it's actually a pretty good time to try to add in some more of these greens just to kind of darken them up. Again, make them a little bit smaller as you go. Let's just do that. There, sure, why not? Let those lines to get a little bit closer together the further they are. We're just trying to add a little more definition. We don't want to overdo it, because if you overdo it, then you're going to kind of tend more towards that perfectionist route. I mean, overdo it if you want to, but I find that the more simple you keep some of this stuff, the better it's going to ultimately look, because your imagination is so powerful at filling in some of those dots and some of those things that when you try to be super perfect about it, it actually ends up kind of working against you, and your imagination goes, well, that's not how I saw it, so it's wrong. Versus if you leave something to the imagination, then your imagination fills in the gaps and goes, yeah, that looks about right. We could come in here and add in some more kind of vibrancy too into at least some of the foreground part of this field if we want to. You don't need to, but you can. And I am going to take a second to dry this again. And now I want to actually, for that little last sliver of that final field you can see, I want to use some green that's kind of similar to this, but I need a little bit more. So we'll start off with some of those, start with some of that key lime pie color, maybe a little bit of that blue raspberry, some of that blueberry muffin. Let's just check it compared to our other colors. We want it to be darker and a little more vibrant. I'm going to grab some of that tropical punch too. You could also kind of tend more towards the whimsical side of colors for something like this, but this is actually going to be a nice contrast color here. So I'm going to just put that in that final little sliver here. And again, if you wanted to, you can kind of bump up the color between those two, the border, just to give it a little more separation. You don't need to, but you can. Doesn't need to be perfect. And the next thing we're going to want to do is we want to start kind of building in some of that. I'm going to choose to make kind of a grassy type texture that's going to start up here, go to about a third of the way up, and then come down. So I can actually just use, let's start with our back layer of that grass using some of that color we just used since we already have it. And just flick upwards. We're going to be adding in a couple layers of this. Now I do, you could leave it like this, or you can soften the bottoms kind of like this, but you want to kind of also soften up and down. This will just help with the kind of transition in a little bit, but you don't really need to if you do enough layers over this. Again, I'm going to take a moment to dry this because the next couple things we're going to do is we're going to add in some trees at the horizon line, and we're also going to add in more layers of that grass. Since I still have some other colors of greens, I'm going to go ahead and start with another layer of that grass. Just a different, it's a different color than the previous one though. You could probably do this in just a couple layers. We're probably going to end up doing a couple extra ones. But I want a few of those. Just going to kind of soften them again. And now we need to mix up a super dark green color. I'm actually going to start this with some of this blue raspberry. I'm going to wash my brush. Let's dip into that yellow ochre type color, that banana split color. And let's grab some more of that blueberry muffin, and let's just check on our color. It's pretty dark, but we need it to be more saturated. If I add in just more of that blue raspberry or blueberry muffin color, that could be a pretty nice color for this. Let's add in a little bit more of that banana split. And maybe a little bit of that blue raspberry just to kind of brighten it a little bit. Okay, so at the horizon line, I'm going to place kind of a line that I'm going to vary the height of to give some indication that there is some kind of greenery in the background. This is one of the things that I always love seeing in the backgrounds, like when I look out into kind of the scenery of the farmland of Colorado, is there always is just a couple like hints of some of this foliage right along the horizon line. And maybe over here it actually kind of butts up to this. Just like that. I'm going to leave that like that for now. And I'm going to just mix in some of this darker color into one of those lighter colors. And again, let's add in some more of these. It's still a little wet, but that's okay. Kind of varying the direction I'm moving my brush, flicking upwards. And let's dry again. I was aiming to make this a under 30-minute painting, but Miss Moogie has come to say hello to me. Hi. Let's get her bed set up. So we need to mix up I want to mix up another green that's really vibrant like this, because the closer things get to us, they really should pack more pigment and be brighter. That's what's going to kind of give the illusion of some of the depth effects. So let's really make a pigmented green. Probably need to re-wet my colors. So that's a pretty bright green, so let's go in with it. Unfortunately, it's so thick, it's going to be kind of hard to... And then rather than what we kind of been doing previously, we are going to drop some water in here. We just want to kind of give some natural textures, but let's also kind of vary how blue and how kind of shadowed certain parts are. So maybe we'll steal some of this. And while it's still wet, it'll give it some extra texture to drop some of this in. Not my favorite grass in the foreground. I maybe would have made some of this lighter, especially in the background, or maybe this just not quite as present, but in general it's kind of a fun little painting. The last one little thing I do want to do to this painting is I'm going to take just some more of this blue, and on a couple of these I'm going to add in a couple more trees and things like that, just to kind of give some variation. So it's a tiny bit less flat. This is a pretty flat painting, but it'll give it a little extra depth, even if you just want to come along with that darker color and just put it right at the bottom of some of that. All right, I'm going to dry this one more time, and I'll take the tape off while I'm doing that too. Again, usually I wait to take the tape off until things have kind of set, because the weak points are here. So if it's not dry and kind of where it's seeped into those cracks, we're going to get some of that on there, but that's okay for today for me. So here is a super simple farmland type painting. There's definitely some things that I wish I had done a little bit better. And this is also the back side of the paper, so it didn't perform quite as well. But I think it's still a nice little study, and if I hadn't been interrupted by Moogie, this would have been a 30-minute painting. So this can be a quick little study of farmland type things. I hope that you had fun doing this, and let's take one more look at it. Also, here it is versus the picture. Let's move these away so I can get that. And I think it's a pretty decent representation of that. It's not perfect, but it is a nice representation.